In 1981, Harley-Davidson was weeks away from complete collapse. The factories were hemorrhaging money, the bikes were hemorrhaging oil, and the dealers were hemorrhaging customers. America's last motorcycle company wasn't being killed by the Japanese. It was being killed by the people who owned it. AMF Corporation had owned Harley-Davidson since 1969. A company famous for making bowling balls and tennis rackets had spent 13 years running America's most iconic motorcycle brand into the ground. They doubled production, gutted quality control, and shipped bikes out the door that weren't ready to leave the factory. By the late 1970s, Harley-Davidson motorcycles were leaking oil straight off the assembly line. Engines vibrated so violently that bolts would shake loose on the highway. Chrome rusted within months. The paint peeled before the first winter. Bikes broke down so frequently that riders started carrying toolkits not as precaution, but as a necessity. The quality had collapsed so completely that Harley-Davidson motorcycles had become an embarrassment to the dealers selling them. And what they found was devastating. Honda, Kawasaki, Yamaha, Suzuki. Japanese manufacturers had quietly taken over the American motorcycle market. By 1980, Japanese brands controlled 60% of the market. Harley held less than 4%. Dealerships that had sold Harleys for generations started refusing new inventory. Why stock a bike that comes back for warranty repairs before the customer makes the first payment? Then, in 1981, 13 Harley-Davidson executives did something almost unheard of in American corporate history. They bought the company back. With borrowed money, against all logic, against every financial indicator saying Harley-Davidson was already dead. This is the story of the last American motorcycle and how it refused to die. Chapter 1. Born in a Shed. The story begins in a small wooden shed in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1903. William S. Harley was 21 years old. Arthur Davidson was 20. Together, they built a motorized bicycle with a single-cylinder engine so underpowered it still required pedaling up steep hills. The shed measured 10 feet by 15 feet. The first factory in company history was barely bigger than a garden shed. It was humble. It was modest. And it was the beginning of one of the greatest manufacturing stories in American history. Within 2 years, the Davidson brothers, Walter and William, joined Arthur, had quit their day jobs to work on motorcycles full-time. By 1906, they outgrew the shed and built a proper factory on Juneau Avenue. That building still stands in Milwaukee today, over a century later. In 1907, the company formally incorporated. They built 150 motorcycles that year. Word spread fast. The early Harleys were reliable in a way that most motor vehicles of that era simply weren't. Roads in 1905 America were rough, unpaved, rutted. A vehicle had to be tough to survive them. And Harleys were tough. Riders discovered they could push a Harley hard in terrible conditions, and it kept running. That reputation, built one satisfied rider at a time, became the foundation of everything that followed. By 1910, they were producing 3,200 motorcycles a year. Police departments across America started buying Harleys for patrol duty. They were reliable enough for law enforcement, which meant they were reliable enough for anything. The Harley-Davidson reputation grew alongside the orders. Then came the First World War, and Harley-Davidson became something bigger than a company. They became part of the American war effort. The U.S. military needed reliable, fast transportation for dispatch riders, soldiers who carried messages between command posts across the chaos of war. Harley-Davidson supplied over 20,000 motorcycles to the Allied forces. The Model J, the workhorse of that era, carried messages through the mud and rubble of France and Belgium. When the war ended in 1918, a photograph went around the world. A U.S. Army corporal named Roy Holtz, sitting on his Harley in Hachi, Germany, one of the first Allied soldiers to enter German territory. He was riding a Harley. The men who came home from that war knew Harley-Davidson. They had trusted their lives to these machines in the worst conditions imaginable. When they returned to civilian life, many of them bought one. The loyalty was bone deep. The 1920s brought prosperity and competition. Indian Motorcycle, Harley's oldest and fiercest rival, founded in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1901, battled Harley for every sale. The two companies pushed each other relentlessly. Harley introduced the iconic 45-degree V-twin engine configuration that would define the brand forever. They launched the JD model with a more powerful 74 cubic inch engine. Innovation was constant. By 1920, Harley-Davidson was the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, selling bikes in 67 countries, exporting to Australia, Japan, South Africa. The little shed on 38th Street had become a global operation in less than 2 decades. The 4 original founders, William Harley and the 3 Davidson brothers, were all still running the company. They had built something together that had started as a hobby and become an empire. And they had done it with their hands, their minds, and a work ethic that their employees respected and tried to match. The workers on the factory floor were part of that identity. In those early decades, Harley-Davidson was a craftsman's company. Machinists who took pride in tolerances measured to thousandths of an inch. Assemblers who knew every bolt on every model. Men who rode the bikes they built and would personally feel the shame if one let a customer down. That culture of craftsmanship, born in the Juneau Avenue factory in the 1910s and 1920s, would become both Harley's greatest strength and the thing most devastated when the wrong owners arrived decades later. Chapter 2. Through War, Depression, and Glory. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed and the Great Depression began. What followed was the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Unemployment reached 25%, banks failed, factories closed, families lost everything. Motorcycle sales collapsed almost overnight. Who buys a motorcycle when they can't afford food? Dozens of American motorcycle manufacturers went bankrupt between 1929 and 1933. The industry, which had been thriving just years before, was devastated. But Harley-Davidson survived? Barely. At the Depression's lowest point, Harley was producing fewer than 4,000 motorcycles a year, down from over 20,000 in the late 1920s. The company cut wages, cut staff, cut everything that could be cut. But they refused to cut corners on the product itself. The bikes that left the Juneau Avenue factory during the Depression were still built with the same care as the bikes built in boom years. That decision, quality above survival pressure, preserved the brand's reputation for the decades to come. They survived through police contracts, military orders, and the fierce loyalty of riders who wouldn't switch brands no matter how tight money got. A Harley rider in 1932 didn't become an Indian rider just because times were hard. That loyalty, irrational by economic logic, absolute in practice, kept the company alive. When World War II arrived, Harley-Davidson transformed almost entirely into a military supplier. Between 1941 and 1945, they built over 90,000 motorcycles for the Allied forces, nearly all of them the WLA model. The WLA was olive drab, stripped of chrome, fitted with a rifle scabbard and a blackout headlight. Soldiers called it the Liberator. The Liberator carried dispatches through the deserts of North Africa. It scouted roads through the forests of France. It rolled into liberated towns ahead of the infantry, a young American soldier on the seat, civilians lining the streets. In one of the most iconic images of the liberation of Europe, Harleys appeared again and again, not as symbols of rebellion, as symbols of freedom arriving. After the war, the men who had ridden liberators in Europe and the Pacific came home to America. Many of them missed the feeling, the freedom of the open road, the wind, the engine. They formed motorcycle clubs. They organized rides. They gathered at diners and fairgrounds and open stretches of American highway. and they rode Harleys because that's what they had ridden when it mattered most. In 1947, an event in Hollister, California, a motorcycle rally that got rowdy and made the front page of Life magazine, created the outlaw biker image that Hollywood would run with for decades. The 1953 film The Wild One with Marlon Brando made the leather jacket and the motorcycle permanently intertwined in American culture. Brando rode a Triumph in the film, but America imagined him on a Harley. The image stuck. Then, in 1953, the last remaining threat to Harley's American dominance disappeared. Indian Motorcycle, after years of financial struggles and management failures, shut down permanently. The company that had been Harley's rival since 1901 was gone. Harley-Davidson was now officially the last American motorcycle manufacturer. I have covered Indian Motorcycle in detail in a separate video. You can check out that video after this. The 1950s and 1960s were the glory years. The Duo Glide launched in 1958, a touring bike with rear suspension that made long highway rides genuinely comfortable. The Electra Glide arrived in 1965 with electric starting, ending the need to kickstart the engine. American riders loved it. It became the definitive highway cruiser, the bike that defined what a Harley was supposed to be. Workers at the Juneau Avenue factory during these years describe a specific feeling: pride, real, tangible pride. Walking into a dealership and seeing your work on the floor. Seeing a rider look at a bike you helped build and want it. Seeing that bike head out onto the open road. These weren't just factory workers. They were craftsmen building American icons. And they knew it. By the late 1960s, Harley-Davidson was the undisputed king of American motorcycling. It had outlasted every domestic competitor, served in 2 world wars, survived the Depression, and embedded itself permanently in the American cultural identity. And then, in 1969, the wrong people bought it. Chapter 3. The Bowling Ball Company takes over. In 1969, American Machine and Foundry, AMF, purchased Harley-Davidson for $21 million. AMF was a massive industrial conglomerate. They made bowling equipment, tennis rackets, golf clubs, submarines, and nuclear reactor components. They were experts at high-volume manufacturing, but they knew nothing about motorcycles, motorcycle culture, or what made Harley-Davidson sacred to the people who rode it. To AMF, Harley-Davidson wasn't an American institution. It was an underperforming asset, a revenue stream to be optimized, a production line that needed to run faster. They pushed production from roughly 15,000 motorcycles per year towards 70,000, nearly 5 times as many bikes from facilities, tooling, and workers that weren't equipped to handle that volume. AMF even moved some production to a new facility in York, Pennsylvania, away from Harley's experienced Milwaukee craftsmen, where labor was cheaper and workers had no history with the product. The Juneau Avenue workers who had built Harleys with pride for decades watched in horror. They weren't building motorcycles anymore. They were feeding an assembly line quota. Quality checks that used to stop production got bypassed. Defects that used to be fixed before shipping were documented and sent down the line anyway. Workers who raised concerns were told the same thing: keep the line moving. One mechanic who worked at Juneau Avenue during the AMF years described it simply: "We used to joke that AMF stood for anything's missing, find it. Because you'd open a new bike and something was always wrong. Always. A bolt missing. A seal not seated right. We were embarrassed. Genuinely embarrassed to put our names on those machines." And it showed. Oil leaked from engines that hadn't been properly sealed during rushed assembly. Electrical systems failed within weeks of purchase. Chrome rusted before the first winter. The shovelhead engine, Harley's flagship motor of that era, earned a brutal reputation for unreliability. Vibration so severe that bolts shook loose at highway speed became a routine complaint. Riders started carrying full toolkits not as a precaution, but as a requirement. Dealerships were caught in an impossible position. They had spent years sometimes generations, building reputations on the Harley name. Now they were selling bikes that came back for warranty repairs before the customer made the first payment. Some dealers quietly started refusing new inventory. Others began stocking Japanese bikes alongside the Harleys just to keep their doors open. The humiliation was real, and it was complete. The riders who stayed loyal, and there were thousands of them, stubborn and proud, started modifying their AMF-era Harleys heavily just to make them reliable. The custom bike culture that exploded in this era was partly aesthetic, partly necessity. If you were going to ride a Harley, you were probably going to have to fix it yourself. Riders became mechanics. Garages became workshops. Meanwhile, AMF's relationship with the Harley workforce deteriorated steadily. Union tensions that had been manageable for decades became serious. Strikes slowed production further. Morale on the factory floor, once the source of Harley's greatest strength, collapsed. The craftsmen who had taken personal pride in every bike they built felt that pride stripped away. They were now just workers, feeding a corporate quota. The identity of the Harley-Davidson factory worker, built over 60 years, had been destroyed in a decade. By the late 1970s, AMF itself could see the situation was unsustainable. They put Harley-Davidson on the market. For a period, there were no buyers. Who would purchase a motorcycle company with collapsing quality, furious dealers, a demoralized workforce, and a brand that had become a national punchline? The company that had been the last American motorcycle manufacturer, the company that had carried soldiers to war, sat on the market like a property nobody wanted. Chapter 4. The Japanese Invasion. While AMF was destroying Harley from the inside, something was happening in the American marketplace that turned a crisis into an existential threat. In 1959, Honda opened its first American office in Los Angeles with just $1 million in capital and 6 employees. The American motorcycle industry dismissed them immediately. Honda made small, lightweight bikes, 125 cubic centimeters and 250 cubic centimeters machines that weighed less than 250 pounds. Real motorcycle riders would never consider a Honda. The market segments were completely different. Honda didn't try to take Harley's customers. They created entirely new ones. The "You meet the nicest people on a Honda" advertising campaign in 1963 deliberately repositioned motorcycles in the American imagination. Instead of dangerous rebels in leather jackets, Honda showed normal people, housewives running errands, students riding to class, families exploring suburban roads on their lightweight, cheerful machines. It worked beyond anyone's expectations. Honda sold 90,000 motorcycles in America in 1964 alone. By 1966, Honda's annual American sales exceeded everything Harley-Davidson had ever produced in a single year. Then Kawasaki, Yamaha, and Suzuki arrived. And unlike Honda's initial small bike strategy, these manufacturers came directly after the large motorcycle market that Harley had always owned. The Honda CB750, launched in 1969, was a declaration of war. 4 cylinders, overhead cam, disc brakes, electric starting, silky smooth at any speed. It didn't leak. It didn't vibrate loose. It started every single time. And it cost less than a comparable Harley. Motorcycle journalists ran comparison tests. The results were devastating for Harley. Japanese bikes were faster, smoother, more reliable, easier to maintain, and less expensive. Riders who had been loyal to Harley for years tried a Honda or a Kawasaki and discovered that motorcycles didn't have to be unreliable, that carrying a toolkit wasn't normal, that riding a bike shouldn't feel like a wager. Harley's official response was denial and derision. Company executives called Japanese bikes rice burners. They insisted publicly that genuine American motorcyclists would always choose a Harley, that the brand loyalty was unshakable. Meanwhile, sales figures told a completely different story. By 1980, Japanese manufacturers controlled 60% of the American motorcycle market. Honda alone sold more motorcycles in America annually than Harley's entire production capacity. Kawasaki, Yamaha, and Suzuki divided the remaining market between them. Harley-Davidson, the company that had built motorcycles for the U.S. military in 2 world wars, that had outlasted every American competitor, that had defined what a motorcycle meant to 3 generations of Americans, held less than 4% of the market in its own country. 4%. In America. The country Harley had called home for 80 years. Chapter 5. The Buyback. In early 1981, 13 Harley-Davidson executives made a decision that everyone around them called either courageous or insane. They would buy the company from AMF themselves. The leader was Vaughn Beals, Harley's CEO, a former aerospace engineer who had come to believe that Harley could be saved, but only if it was free from AMF's quarterly earnings obsession. Around him were senior engineers, managers, and company veterans, people who had watched the AMF years with increasing horror, people who still believed in what Harley-Davidson was supposed to be. The price was $1.5 million. The 13 executives had almost none of that money personally. They assembled a leveraged buyout, a financial structure where borrowed money funds the purchase and the acquired company's own assets serve as collateral. It was high risk to the point of being reckless. If Harley didn't recover quickly, the debt would destroy it faster than AMF had. The deal closed on June 16, 1981. That evening, the 13 executives and dozens of supporters rode motorcycles in a convoy from York, Pennsylvania to Milwaukee, reclaiming the journey home. It was theatrical. It was emotional. And it was exactly right. Harley-Davidson belonged to motorcycle people again. The celebration was short. When Beals and his team opened the actual financial records, the reality was worse than expected. Harley was losing money on almost every bike it sold. Inventory management was a disaster. Millions of dollars tied up in unsold motorcycles in warehouses, while the production line simultaneously ran short on parts. Quality defect rates were staggering. One internal assessment found that a significant percentage of motorcycles coming off the line required immediate rework before they could be shipped. The famous story from those first weeks: Beals walked the York factory floor and found brand new, fully assembled motorcycles standing on the production floor leaking oil onto the concrete, not bikes awaiting repair. Fresh bikes, off the line, dripping, before they had moved an inch. He walked back to his office and understood the full magnitude of what they had bought. They had bought a burning building, and now they had to put out the fire while living in it. Chapter 6. Fighting for Survival. The new management team made a decision that struck observers as deeply ironic. To save America's most iconic motorcycle brand, they would study the manufacturing methods of the Japanese companies destroying it. Harley executives traveled to Honda and Kawasaki factories in Japan. They studied a production philosophy called just-in-time inventory management, the concept of ordering parts only when needed, in precisely the quantities required, rather than stockpiling massive warehouse inventories. They studied statistical process control, a quality monitoring method where workers themselves tracked defect rates in real time. They watched Japanese factory floors where workers were empowered to stop the production line when they spotted problems. The contrast with what they had come from was staggering. Harley implemented just-in-time immediately. Inventory costs dropped by 50% within 2 years. Factory floors that had been cluttered with excess parts and half-finished bikes became organized and efficient. Wasted capital that had been sitting in warehouses started flowing back into the business. They rebuilt quality control from the ground up. Every motorcycle would be inspected multiple times during assembly. Workers were not only allowed to stop the production line for defects, they were required to. The cultural shift took time. Workers who had spent the AMF years being told to ignore problems had to be convinced that management actually meant it now. But slowly, it took hold. The old craftsman pride that had defined Harley's workforce before AMF began to return. But quality improvements took time, and Harley was running out of it. Japanese manufacturers were still flooding the American market with superior bikes at lower prices. In 1983, Harley took a step that some called protectionist and others called survival. They petitioned the U.S. government for tariff protection. The argument was that Japanese manufacturers were dumping motorcycles in America, selling them at below-cost prices specifically to eliminate American competition. President Ronald Reagan, not typically an advocate for trade protectionism, granted the petition. A 45% tariff was imposed on Japanese motorcycles over 700 cubic centimeters imported into the United States. It was a lifeline. Japanese manufacturers could no longer simply undercut Harley on price in the American market. Then, in 1985, disaster struck from a completely unexpected direction. Harley's primary lender, Citibank, decided to exit the leveraged buyout financing business entirely and called in Harley's loan. The company had 30 days to find new financing or face forced liquidation. Von Beals called every major bank in America. They all said no. A motorcycle company with years of losses and a damaged brand was not an attractive lending proposition. With days remaining before the deadline, a smaller commercial lender called Heller Financial agreed to refinance the debt. The crisis passed, but it had been the closest call of the entire survival story. Not the AMF years, not the buyback, but a bank's decision to change its portfolio strategy nearly ended Harley-Davidson permanently in 1985. And then, in 1987, Harley did something that announced to the world that the survival was real. They petitioned the Reagan administration to remove the Japanese motorcycle tariffs 1 year ahead of schedule. The protection was no longer needed. Harley could compete on its own terms. It was a statement of confidence that reverberated through American industry, business schools, and the halls of Congress. The company that had been begging for government protection 4 years earlier was now turning it down. Chapter 7. The Comeback and the Legacy. The turning point had been the Evolution engine, introduced in 1984. The Evo, as writers immediately nicknamed it, was a revelation. It ran cooler. It produced more power. It was more fuel efficient. And the detail that mattered more than any specification, it did not leak oil. After years of oil leak jokes and constant maintenance, the Evolution engine was the mechanical proof that the new Harley-Davidson had truly changed. Riders who had given up on the brand started paying attention again. Motorcycle journalists who had been writing devastating reviews for a decade published genuine praise. The product was, finally, worthy of the legend. But Harley understood that fixing the product was only half the battle. The other half was rebuilding the community. In 1983, Harley had launched the Harley Owners Group, HOG, a factory-sponsored riding club open to every Harley owner. Local chapters formed in cities across America. Members organized group rides, attended rallies together, raised money for veterans' charities, and most importantly, built friendships around a shared identity. By the late 1980s, HOG had hundreds of thousands of members. By the 1990s, it would become the largest factory-sponsored motorcycle organization in the world. Harley also made a deliberate strategic choice. Instead of competing with Japanese manufacturers on technology and specifications, they would compete on something no factory in Japan could manufacture: American identity and heritage, the rumble of the V-twin, the chrome, the century of history, the image of the open American road. You weren't buying a machine, you were buying into a story that stretched back to that wooden shed in Milwaukee in 1903. Celebrities began riding Harleys openly. Willie Nelson, Clint Eastwood, Malcolm Forbes, the billionaire publisher, became a passionate HOG member and advocate, bringing the brand into boardrooms and country clubs that had never considered a motorcycle. Veterans organizations adopted Harley as their brand, Blue-collar workers, who saw Harley as proof that American manufacturing could survive, attached their identity to the brand. In 1986, Harley went public on the New York Stock Exchange. The IPO was oversubscribed. More investors wanted shares than were available. 5 years after the buyback, the company that had been unsellable was now a stock market success. By the early 1990s, Harley held 63% of the American heavyweight motorcycle market. Dealers who had refused Harley inventory a decade earlier were now on waiting lists to receive more bikes. Customers were waiting 6 months to a year for new Harleys. Used Harleys sold for more than their original retail price. The brand's merchandise operation, clothing, accessories, memorabilia, became a billion-dollar business on its own. The Harley logo was tattooed on more human bodies than any other corporate symbol in history. Harvard Business School wrote case studies about the Harley-Davidson turnaround. Business books were published. It was taught in MBA programs around the world as the definitive example of brand rescue, quality recovery, and community-driven marketing. The 13 executives who had borrowed money to buy a failing company in 1981 had created one of the most celebrated comebacks in the history of American business. Today, Harley-Davidson faces its next chapter. An aging core customer base, younger Americans riding motorcycles at lower rates. The shift to electric vehicles reshaping the entire industry. The company is navigating these challenges with its live-wire electric motorcycle brand and international expansion efforts. Not every decision has been perfect. Not every challenge has been met smoothly. But the company is still there. Still building motorcycles in America. Still the last name standing from an industry that once had dozens of American manufacturers. And still the bike that people tattoo on their skin, that veterans ride to honor the fallen, that appears in every Hollywood film that wants to communicate freedom on the open road. What Harley's survival means goes beyond motorcycles, or market share, or business school case studies. In the 1970s and 1980s, American manufacturing was collapsing across every industry: steel, electronics, textiles. The story of that era is largely a story of American industries that couldn't survive, couldn't adapt, couldn't compete, couldn't hold on. Harley-Davidson was supposed to be part of that story. Another casualty, another plant closure, another American brand sold for parts and forgotten. Instead, it became the counter-argument, the proof that American manufacturing could fight back, that quality, identity, and community, rebuilt from the ground up by people who refused to let something sacred disappear, could defeat even the most overwhelming competition. In 1903, 2 young men built a motorcycle in a shed smaller than most living rooms. In 1981, 13 executives borrowed everything they had to buy that legacy back from a bowling ball company. What happened in the years between those 2 moments, and what happened after, is one of the great stories of American industry. So here's what I want to know. Do you remember the AMF years? Did your father warn you away from Harleys in the late 1970s because of the quality? Or were you one of the loyal riders who stuck with the brand through the worst of it, when everyone around you was switching to Hondas? Did you ride a Liberator in the war? Did your grandfather? Did you feel something when you heard what happened to that company after everything it had meant to the men who fought? Do you remember when the Evolution engine came out and Harley finally felt like a real motorcycle again? Were you in a dealership when the waiting lists started? When the brand went from embarrassment to obsession? Leave a comment. Tell me your Harley story. The good years, the bad years, or both. If this story hit you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who rides. Subscribe for more stories about American companies that refuse to die. And check out my video on Indian Motorcycle, the brand that didn't survive. The story of why one American icon made it and the other didn't is more fascinating than you think. America's last motorcycle is still running. And after everything it went through, that means something.